Welcome to Microeconomic Analysis, our reading on demand and supply analysis, focusing on the firm. Okay, so our first LOS asks us to calculate, interpret and compare accounting profit, economic profit, normal profit and economic rent. Let's start with accounting profit. Now, accounting profit is net income in the income statement, and of course accounting profit is the revenues minus explicit costs, and we calculate those costs based on the accruals method in accounts. It's the cost that we've actually incurred. Now let's contrast that with economic profit. Notice the starting point for economic profit is accounting profit, but then we're going to deduct implicit costs. What are the implicit costs? They're the opportunity costs of resources that are actually supplied by the owner. And there are really two sources of resources supplied by the owner. We talk about the return on owner capital, in other words, the return on the funds that they've invested in the company, and also the opportunity cost of the owner's time. Now, the opportunity cost of the owner's time is looking at the time and their entrepreneurial ability that is tied up in this firm. And it's saying, well, look, if they didn't spend their time and entrepreneurial ability here, what could they earn elsewhere? Okay, so two sources of implicit costs: the return on the actual capital they've got invested, the equity they've got invested in the company, and also the return on their time and entrepreneurial ability. Now, economic profit, notice, is accounting profit minus these implicit costs. Often economic profit is known as abnormal profit as well. Accounting profit, of course, only includes charge for the debt holders. It includes an interest charge, but there's no charge included for the equity holders. Contrast that with economic profit, where we're deducting the implicit costs to meet the required return of the equity holders, in this case the person that set up the firm, the return on their funds invested and the return on their time and entrepreneurial ability. Now, what we should state as well is normal profit. Notice normal profit is when economic profit equals zero. What this means is we're meeting the required returns of the investors but not exceeding them. Now, what we should point out very clearly here is that accounting profit would be positive even when economic profit is zero. A zero economic profit means we're essentially providing a competitive rate of return for the providers of capital, on wages and on entrepreneurial talent. The effect on equity values, well, if economic profits are positive, the firm's stock price should start to rise. Economic profit equals zero means we're meeting their required returns. Positive economic profit means we're exceeding investors' required returns, and therefore equity values should rise. Now, we were also asked to talk about economic rent. Now, what this is payment to a factor of production over and above its next highest valued use. Okay, so let's have a little look. We've got elastic supply and inelastic supply of our factor of production here. Let's imagine we're looking at labour, and therefore price would be wages and quantity is the quantity of labour supplied. Perfectly elastic supply means essentially there's a lot of supply out there. The supply is not really a function of price. Now, notice there is no economic rent in this situation. Imagine the scenario of low-skilled labour. Well, chances are you're getting paid pretty much the same as what you would get paid in your next best alternative, and hence economic rent is zero. Now, let's turn our attention to an inelastic supply. Let's imagine a professional sportsman. Now, of course, inelastic supply, limited amount of quantity here because they possess skills that other people don't. Now, you might argue that a professional sportsman, let's imagine a soccer player, gets paid a very, very high wage, and their next best alternative, if they weren't a soccer player, might be far, far lower than the wage that they're being paid. And as a result, the difference between what they're getting paid as a soccer player and what they could get paid in an alternative source of employment, the difference is our economic rent. Now, we're asked to calculate and interpret and compare total, average and marginal revenue. And here we are, we're starting with perfect competition here. Now, notice when we look at perfect competition that the demand curve, our horizontal black line there, is equal to market price. We talk about these firms being essentially price takers. They can't increase the price above the market price because no one would buy any of their goods. They can't reduce their price below the market price because they'd make economic losses and go out of business. In other words, in perfect competition, the market price is the price that gives them zero economic profit. Now notice what we're saying, as quantity sold increases, price is not increasing at all. In other words, to sell extra quantity, you don't need to drop your price. Price is going to be the same for every single unit that we sell. And because price is the same for every single unit that we sell, our marginal revenue, which is the additional revenue from selling one extra unit, is equal to the average revenue. Now, we can imagine total revenue as being price times quantity. Average revenue is total revenue divided by quantity. The key point here, though, is that marginal revenue equals average revenue equals the market price. All units are sold at exactly the same price, regardless of the quantity that we're actually selling. Now, let's turn our attention to imperfect competition. Notice we now have a downward sloping demand curve. And the reason we have a downward sloping demand curve is to sell greater quantities, we're going to have to cut price. Now, it's critical that you understand here that if we cut price, it's on all of the units sold. Okay? In other words, we have to charge the same price to all customers. So what this means is that marginal revenue, the additional revenue, is less than price for quantities greater than 1. In other words, if you go from 1 unit to 2 units, we're going to have to cut the price on both of those units, meaning marginal revenue is less than price. Now, what you'll notice as well is as quantity rises, marginal revenue drops. And in fact, we could argue that total revenue will be maximised when marginal revenue equals 0. In other words, if your goal is to maximise revenue, if marginal revenue is positive, keep on producing and selling. Remember what marginal revenue is. It's the additional revenue that we get from selling 1 extra unit. So, as long as it's positive, it makes sense to sell 1 extra unit, keep producing and selling 1 extra unit. And of course, as we sell more and more, we're having to cut the price, and as a result, marginal revenue is dropping until marginal revenue finally equals 0. Our next LOS asks us to describe the firm's factors of production. And you can see we've got the classic factors of production here. Land, i.e. the location in which the firm is based. Labour, both skilled labour and unskilled labour. Capital, which of course is the physical capital, the plant, property and equipment that the firm operates from. And of course that's financed from financial capital. And we've got materials, which are materials are really the inputs into the production process. So they could be raw materials that we're using here. They could be components, i.e. finished goods from other firms. Now, often we're simply going to use labour and capital, and what we're going to do is produce a production function. What we're going to argue is that the quantity that we're going to produce is a function of capital and labour. So quantity produced is some function of capital and labour, and we refer to that as a production function. Okay, so what we're looking at here is our production function. Now this production function here is assuming that we're holding capital constant. So if you notice, what we've got on our y-axis is total output, and what we've got on our x-axis is the quantity of labour. So we are holding our capital in this particular diagram. We're holding our capital constant over time. So notice what we're really seeing in this diagram. We're seeing how output varies as the quantity of labour changes. Now, first of all, we've got marginal product increasing. What is the marginal product of labour? It's the additional output that 1 extra worker could produce. That's our definition of marginal product. Now notice, initially our marginal product is actually increasing. What we're saying here is 2 workers produce more than 2 times the output of a single worker. Why is this the case? It's probably due to specialisation. As you employ some more labour, each each unit of labour, each worker can actually specialise on a specific task, and as a result, by employing 2 workers, you get more than twice the output. And as a result, the marginal product, the additional product of employing 1 extra unit of resource, in this case labour, is increasing. Now, at some point, we're going to see marginal product decreasing. We refer to this as diminishing returns. Remember, our capital is constant here. So as we increase labour, eventually the output that workers produce will start to drop. The additional product, the marginal product that each additional labour produces will start to fall. So in this area of marginal product decreasing, as we add workers, the output is still increasing, but it's increasing at a diminishing rate. That's what we mean by marginal product decreasing. And it's probably, as I said, due to capital shortages. Remember, we're holding capital constant here. Now notice we've also got an area of negative marginal product. Now what this means is, as you add extra workers, your total output actually falls. Now let's take that on and talk about, and calculate and interpret, total, average, marginal, fixed and variable costs for the firm. Okay, let's just start with our diagram here. What we can see is we've got a line, a straight line on the bottom of the diagram at about $20 per day that says TFC. Now that TFC stands for total fixed cost. Let's define a fixed cost. A fixed cost is any cost that does not vary in line with output. So you'll notice as our quantities are increasing here, total fixed cost is not changing at all. Now, total variable cost are all of the variable costs of the production process, inputs that vary in line with quantity, such as wages, raw materials, and that kind of thing. Okay, and notice you'll see that your total variable cost line is increasing as quantity changes. You'll actually notice that initially, with your total variable cost and total cost curves themselves, first of all, they exhibit decreasing marginal cost, and that's because they're linked to the marginal product of labour. As you increase labour, the marginal product of labour is increasing, and therefore the marginal cost of producing, in this diagram, shirts per day, is dropping. But then we get to the point, you can see, where the where the total cost curve starts to have a steeper gradient. So essentially marginal cost is actually increasing. So notice marginal cost decreases and then increases, and we can see that in the curvature of our total variable cost line. The final line on our diagram is just total cost. Now this is simply total variable cost plus total fixed cost. Notice the 2 black arrows on our diagram. All we're trying to say is, look, these distances are the same. In other words, the difference between total cost and total variable costs is simply the fixed costs. Now let's turn our attention to average costs and marginal costs. Again, let's just make sure we're happy with all the phrases that we're seeing on this slide. First of all, let's start off with our black line that we can see on the slide that says MC. That is the marginal cost of producing a shirt. What does marginal cost mean? It's simply the additional cost for producing 1 extra shirt. Other lines that we've got on there, ATC, the average total cost. Now this is simply the total cost from the previous slide of producing your shirts divided by quantity. So total cost divided by quantity is going to give us average total cost. Notice we've also got average variable cost, which is total variable cost divided by quantity. And again, it's very similar, isn't it, to the average total cost curve in terms of shape. Now, one curve that's very different shaped is the average fixed cost curve. Remember, total fixed costs do not vary in line with output. But average fixed costs, of course, will fall the more you produce. How do we calculate average fixed costs? Total fixed costs divided by quantity. So total fixed costs will not change, but of course, as quantity goes up, average fixed cost is going to fall. So you notice that is diminishing the more we produce. Now, there are a few other things that we really need to be happy about here. Notice our marginal cost curve, the cost of producing an additional shirt. Notice initially that it's dropping. It drops from $3 down to, I don't know, slightly over $1. Why? Again, it's linked to the marginal product of labour. Remember what we saw with our marginal product of labour, the additional output for extra workers. We saw initially, as we employed extra workers, their marginal product increased before they then started to show diminishing returns. So whilst the marginal product of labour is actually increasing, the marginal cost curve should decrease. You'll notice then we start to exhibit diminishing returns, so the marginal cost, the cost of producing one extra shirt, starts to rise. Now again, two other points that we really need to make sure that we focus on and can describe are the points where the marginal cost curve goes through the average variable cost and the average total cost curve, so these points here. Let's start off with the average variable cost curve. What you'll notice is if marginal cost is below average variable cost, if you produce one extra shirt, then average variable cost will fall. As soon as marginal cost goes above average variable cost, if you produce one extra unit of shirts, then average variable cost will rise. In other words, marginal cost will go through the lowest point of the average variable cost curve. It's the same with average total cost. If marginal cost, the cost of producing one extra shirt, is lower than the average total cost of producing a shirt, if you produce that one extra shirt, then average total cost will fall. So as long as marginal cost is below average total cost, as we increase our output, average total cost is falling. As soon as marginal cost goes above average total cost, then if we produce extra units, that's going to pull the average total cost up. So again, marginal cost will hit the lowest point on the average total cost curve. Now we need to talk about break even and shutdown. Now again, this depends on whether we're looking at the long run or the short run. In the short run, fixed costs are going to be incurred whether you produce items or you produce nothing. They cannot be avoided. And if they can't be avoided in the short run, then maybe we shouldn't consider them. Variable costs, though, well, of course, these can be avoided. If you don't produce anything, you don't incur any variable costs. So let's have a look at our diagram there. Let's look at P2, which is our average variable cost line. Now the idea is if the price level for the firm was below P2, the firm would shut down in both the short and the long run. Why? Because if price was lower than P2, you're not even covering your variable costs. Therefore, it makes sense. Don't produce anything and don't incur any variable costs. Notice if the price is between P2 and P1, they'll operate in the short run, but shut down in the long run. Now remember the difference between average variable costs and average total costs. It's the fixed costs. So if price is above P2, we're covering our variable costs, but because it's below P1, we're not fully covering our fixed costs. Now given that fixed costs are irrelevant in the short run because they cannot be avoided, we would continue to operate in the short run. However, of course, in the long run, in order to make a profit, a normal profit, you're going to need to cover both your fixed and your variable costs. Okay, so between P2 and P1, operate in the short run, shut down in the long run. Now, of course, at the point P1, where price equals average total cost, we are making a normal profit. We're making our economic profit of 0. Okay. Now, of course, what that means, remember, is that the price is sufficient to cover both variable costs and fixed costs. Now, of course, once price goes above average total costs, then, of course, we're going to start to make an economic profit, an abnormal profit. Excuse me. Okay, what we should then also point out, therefore, is that for a firm, the marginal cost curve is the firm's supply curve above P2. So essentially, our area, and I'll try and highlight it on here, I'll give it a go anyway. Our area here is the firm's supply curve. Okay. Okay, now it asks us, our next LOS asks us to describe approaches for determining profit maximising levels of output. Now, in our first one, what we're doing is we're comparing total revenue to total costs. Now, again, I should point out that total cost includes those implicit costs, the costs of satisfying the funds provided by the equity investor, as well as their time and entrepreneurial ability. So notice what we're saying is when total revenue equals total cost, the firm breaks even. It makes a normal profit. And remember, zero normal profit doesn't mean zero accounting profit. We have a positive accounting profit here. Remember, we're taking into account the implicit costs of the equity holders within our total cost. So as long as total revenue equals total cost, we break even. Now, therefore, the assumption is, if total revenue is greater than total costs, we must be making economic profit. So, in other words, we should be able to establish, maybe by empirical observation, the points or the quantity level where the difference between total revenue and total cost is at its highest. And that, of course, will be the profit maximising quantity. Only other thing to point out is, notice if total costs are bigger than total revenue, then you're making economic losses and you would go out of business. Now let's have a look at perfect competition here. We've got a diagram of a firm in perfect competition. What you can see on there is the firm's demand curve, which are the horizontal price curves. The reason those are the firm's demand curve is essentially because, remember, in perfect competition you face a flat demand curve where price is equal to demand, is equal to marginal revenue, is equal to average revenue. We said why? In perfect competition, if you raise a price, then you sell nothing. If you cut your price, you make economic losses and go out of business. So therefore, you have to accept the market price, and you face a horizontal demand curve, a perfectly elastic demand curve. Now notice we've also got the firm's marginal costs on there and average total cost. And we've got two prices here. Let's start off if the price was at P1. Now what you do in profit maximisation is we're looking for a profit maximising level where marginal revenue of the firm is equal to marginal cost. So marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. What does this mean? The additional revenue from selling one extra unit is equal to the cost of producing it. Now, of course, if marginal revenue was greater than marginal cost, the additional revenue from producing one extra unit would be greater than the cost of producing it, so you should expand your quantities. And of course, if marginal cost was greater than marginal revenue, then the opposite is true. You should be cutting your quantities. In other words, for a firm, the profit maximising quantity is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, of course, remember this line up here, demand is equal to average revenue and it's equal to marginal revenue in perfect competition. Okay, so the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost is our point here. And that determines the firm's profit maximising quantity. Now you'll notice in this scenario at P1, you'll notice that price is bigger than average total cost. Here's the price per unit. Oh, let me put a mark on it. Here's the price per unit and here's the average total cost per unit. So the difference, our blue shaded rectangle, the difference between price and average total cost at the profit maximising quantity is economic profit, our abnormal profit. So at price P1, this firm is making an economic profit. It's exceeding the investor's required returns. Now in perfect competition, that's only sustainable in the short run. Problem is, if you generate economic profit and you have no barriers to entry, other firms will enter your industry, that will increase industry supply and price will fall. So in the long run, in perfect competition, economic profit should be zero. Let's look at the situation at P2. Now at P2, notice now where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue line is at that point there. Notice what we're saying is at this particular point, at our point I'll just try and scribble a red line on it. At this point, price equals average total cost. And of course, quantity times price gives you total revenue. Quantity times average total cost gives you total cost. So what we're saying is, at this particular point, at P2 and Q2, total revenue equals total cost. A normal profit is being made. The economic profit has been eroded. Now let's have a look at this scenario. Again, it's perfect competition and we're looking at profit maximization here. But notice the scenario, look, again, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Let's put on our, let's label up our diagram. So this is demand, average revenue, and of course also marginal revenue. So the point where marginal cost hits marginal revenue is where the firm will produce. So there we go. Now notice at this point, price is below average total cost. There's price, our red dot, and here's average total cost. In other words, if we were to multiply this out, quantity times price, total revenue, would be less than quantity times average total cost. Total cost. Total revenue less than total cost, we're making economic losses. Now, of course, in this scenario, if you're making economic losses, the firm's going to go out of business in the long run as it is not generating a sufficient return to its providers of finance. Now, we looked at perfect competition. What about imperfect competition? Well, it's the same rule. Notice we're using exactly the same rule. Profit maximization for all firms is where their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. As we said, if marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, it makes sense to produce additional units. If, of course, marginal revenue is lower than marginal cost, it makes sense to cut back. Therefore, the profit maximizing quantity is always the unit where the last unit's additional revenue was equal to its cost. So where our marginal revenue and our marginal cost curves lie. So let's have a look at it on our diagram. There's the marginal revenue. Notice the marginal revenue is not the same as the demand curve, and we talked about why earlier on in imperfect competition. So marginal revenue hits marginal cost. That gives us our profit maximizing quantity. Now let's extend our dotted line upwards until we hit the demand curve, because this establishes our price. Notice as well, if we go to our point where our dotted line hits the average total cost curve, this gives us average total cost per unit. So our little blue shaded box there again represents economic profit. It represents the difference between total revenue, quantity times price, and total cost, quantity times average total cost per unit. So this firm is making an economic profit. And in imperfect competition, it's possible, if you're close to monopoly, that that may be sustained for some time. One other thing to point out as well, actually, before we move on from this slide, is note that in perfect competition, when economic profit was zero, we were producing at a point where average total cost was minimized at the bottom of the average total cost curve. Notice when we have economic profits in the diagram, we are not producing at a quantity that minimizes average total cost per unit. Okay, we've got a little bit on economies and diseconomies of scale. Really what we're looking at here is short run and long run effects. Now the short run average total cost curves are obviously looking at the firm in the short run, and the long run, our big black curve, which just actually joins up all of the minimum points on each short run average total cost curve, forms our long run average total cost curve. Now, the key is, in the short run, your plant size is fixed. In other words, the PP&E, the buildings that the firm operates, is fixed. And that means your short run average total cost curve is fixed in the short run. However, in the long run, you can change the size of your firm. You can change plant size. Your plant size becomes variable. So what we've got is essentially different short run average total cost curves for different sizes of the firm. Now you'll notice then what happens in the long run is initially as we increase the size of the firm in the long run, we benefit from economies of scale. Why do we get economies of scale? What are they? Well, they're the cost savings that we get from labour specialisation, from mass production, from investment in efficient technology, for input and price discounts. And notice, therefore, as the firm expands, it starts to benefit from economies of scale, and therefore the long-run average total cost curve and the short-run average total cost curves are falling. Notice then there is some size of firm, known as the minimum efficient scale, that minimises the long-run average total cost curve. If we go above that, we start to suffer from diseconomies of scale. You might notice this if you work for a large firm. As the firm gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you start to suffer from things such as bureaucratic behaviour that reduces efficiency. You start to suffer from things like having unionised labour forces, etc. So as we expand beyond a set point, the long-run average total cost of production actually starts to rise. So note, therefore, that there is some efficient size of plant, known as the minimum efficient scale, some efficient size of plant that minimises the long-run average total cost and hence quantity. And that's the most profitable scale of production for our firm. Now let's have a look at profit maximisation in the long run. Now note we are looking at perfect competition here. Now in the long run, perfect competition, you can't make economic profit in perfect competition. What that means is, in the long run, price must equal average total cost. If price was bigger than average total cost, you're making economic profits, you'll attract new entrants in and price will fall. And of course, if your price is lower than average total cost, you make economic losses and go out of business. Now notice what we're doing is we're looking at the long-run average total cost curve from our previous slide. In other words, we're looking at how costs are affected as we change the size of the firm, its plant itself. Remember, our short-run average total cost curves are given with the firm size fixed in that point of time. Now notice what we're saying is in the long run, the market price will be P2 as firms move to the efficient scale. So if they start to produce at the efficient scale Q2, okay, that will give them their long-run average total costs. And remember, price would have to be equal to average total costs, which means the price would be at that point there as well. So in the long run, under perfect competition, the firms produce at this point here, which gives them average total costs. And because they cannot generate economic profit in the long run, price has to equal average total cost, which means P2 will be the average total, will be both the price and the average total cost in the long run. In other words, no economic profit earned in the long run. Decreasing cost and increasing cost industries. Am I particularly excited by these? Not massively. Okay, let's have a look at an increasing cost industry. The scenario here is you've got a shift in demand. So you can see demand is shifted from D0 to D1. And when that happens, of course, initially price starts to rise. We move from point 1 to point 2. So we move up the industry supply curve, S0. Now we're looking at an increasing cost industry. What this means, as firms expand their output, they demand more inputs, such as materials, such as labour. And what we're saying is the average cost of those inputs is rising. So rather than costs actually falling as they're producing more, they're finding that their cost of production is rising. This is why their long-run supply curve is upward sloping. So notice when supply shifts to its long run, essentially, you'll notice we end up at point 3, where the equilibrium price at the end point is actually higher than it was at the start because of this increasing cost industry. Now let's turn our attention to a decreasing cost industry. This might be an industry where the input prices, the resources that it uses in its production process, actually start to fall as the industry expands its output. So again, we start off at point 1. There's an increase in demand that shifts us up to point 2. Then, of course, when supply shifts out to meet this increase in price because we're making economic profits, we move to point 3. Now notice this time the price at the end of the process is lower than the price at the start. This is because this firm has a downward sloping supply curve because the costs of production are falling as industry output expands. Right, we've got to be able to calculate total, marginal and average product of labour. Okay, so we've got our workers down the side, 1 worker through to 6 workers, and we've got their total product. That is simply their total output. 1 worker produces 8 units, 2 workers produce 20 units, 3 workers produce 26 units. Then let's look at the marginal product of our labour. Remember, this is the increase in output from 1 additional worker. So as we move from 1 to 2 workers, the output goes from 8 to 20, the difference being 12. So the extra worker produced 12 units marginal product. When we go from 2 to 3 workers, total product goes up by 6. So the marginal product of the 3rd worker is 6 units. You can see as well, when we go from 3 workers to 4 workers, output goes from 26 to 30. So the marginal product of the 4th worker is 4 units. The other column that we've got is average product of the workers. Now that's again a very simple concept. Take the total product and divide by the number of workers. So if 2 workers produce 20 units, their average product is 20 divided by 2, 10 units. If 6 workers produce 33 units, then their average product is 33 divided by 6, 5.5. Now let's start by having a look at our marginal product curves now, the marginal product. Now we've kind of discussed this already. Notice initially when we increase our labour, the marginal product is increasing. 1 worker produced 8 units, but the additional worker produced 12 units. So we've got an increase in the marginal product of labour from 1 unit to 2 units. But notice when we go from 2 units of labour to 3 units of labour, on the previous slide our marginal product was 6. So the 2nd worker produced 12 extra units, but the 3rd worker only produced 6 extra units. So we're now exhibiting diminishing marginal returns to labour. The marginal product of labour is falling, diminishing returns. Now remember, we're looking at marginal product, the output of labour, holding all of our other inputs constant. And we're saying first it increases as we get increasing returns, and then we're going to get diminishing returns as we add more labour. 2nd worker adds 12 units, 3rd worker only adds 6 units, the 4th worker, what did they add? 4 units, etc. So the marginal product of workers is decreasing. Now let's compare marginal and average product. Marginal product is the additional product of 1 extra worker. Average product is total output divided by total workers. Now the argument here is if marginal product is above average product, if you employ 1 extra worker, the average product should rise. If marginal product is greater than average product and you employ more labour, then average product rises. As soon as marginal product falls below average product, if you produce 1 extra unit, then the average product's going to fall. Why? Because the additional that the 1 extra worker is producing is less than the average. If marginal product is greater than average product, the additional output the 1 extra worker is creating is above the average, it pulls the average up. If marginal product is below average product, the additional output 1 extra worker is producing is lower than average, so it pulls the average down. Again, it's very, very important here to note that the marginal product hits average product at the top, at the maximum point of average product. Okay, cost and product curves. We've got marginal and average cost curves, product curves and cost curves. So we've got our average product and marginal product on the left-hand side, and we've got our cost curves, marginal cost and average cost on the right-hand side of the screen. Now let's start at quantities of labour below L1. Now you'll notice below L1, marginal product is actually increasing. So we've got increasing returns as we add labour. And notice, of course, the marginal product is above average product at this point. So as we increase labour, essentially the marginal product's going up, the average product is rising as well. Now you'll notice at the same time the marginal cost is falling. This is because the marginal product is rising at this point in time. Each additional worker is producing more than, when we went back to that idea, one worker produces 1 unit, 2 workers produce more than double the quantity. Okay, so in other words, because marginal product is rising, marginal cost, the additional cost of producing your output, is falling. Okay. So notice then, marginal cost is minimised at the point where marginal product is maximised. Now, if we then increase our labour, so go from L1, between L1 and L2, notice that marginal product is now starting to fall due to diminishing returns. Now, as marginal product starts to fall, marginal cost is now going to start to rise. The additional cost of producing your output is going to start to rise because labour is exhibiting diminishing returns. Now, notice between L1 and L2, the marginal product is still greater than the average product, so as we produce, average continues to rise. Notice then when we hit L2, the average product is equal to the marginal product. If we go beyond this point and produce above L2, employ more labour than L2, then notice the average will start to be pulled down because marginal is now below average. Okay, so let's look at our cost curves that are inherently related to our product curves. Notice therefore that marginal product is maximised where marginal cost is minimised. And remember, essentially, if we maximise marginal product, we're minimising marginal cost. Notice, essentially, average variable cost is minimised where average product is maximised. And that will be the point where marginal cost equals average variable cost. Good. So as you'll notice, the two are inherently linked there on our diagram. What we could see was as marginal product started to fall, marginal cost started to rise. And that's the thing I really want you to take home with you here. When marginal product is at its maximum, marginal cost is at its minimum. Okay, let's talk about some profit maximising input amounts. We're going to introduce a new term here, and that is the marginal revenue product. We've talked about marginal product, and we said it's the additional output that one extra worker could generate. What is marginal revenue product? Well, it's the additional revenue from selling the additional output. In other words, you employ one extra unit, they produce the marginal product. This is therefore the revenue that you get from selling that marginal product. Now, as each extra unit of input is added, output increases, but at a diminishing rate. Okay, in other words, we know at some point we hit diminishing returns. As you add more labour, the marginal product of labour will start to decrease, which means the marginal revenue product of labour will also start to decrease. Now, what is the profit maximising use of labour? We should continue to use labour until the marginal revenue product of labour equals the unit cost. And this is true of actually any of the factors of production, whether we're looking at capital, whether we're looking at labour. So here we're saying hire more workers until the marginal revenue of product of labour is equal to their wage. If the marginal revenue product is greater than wage, what we're saying is we're getting more revenues in from hiring one extra worker than we're actually paying them. So it makes sense to expand. If marginal revenue product was less than wage, then the additional revenues created by the extra worker would below their wage. It makes sense to cut back on labour. So the profit maximising level of labour should be where the marginal revenue product of labour is equal to wage. That's true of capital and any of the other factors of production, not just labour. And this is really trying to take that point home to you. Now, what they're simply saying here is to minimise firms' costs, it must be the case that the marginal product of factor of production A divided by the price of factor of production A should equal the marginal product of factor B over the price of factor B should equal the marginal product of capital over the, marginal product of C over the price of C. The additional output per dollar spent on each input must be equal at the margin. Now, what do we mean by this? Let's think about it in terms of labour and capital. Now, look, we're looking at the marginal product of labour divided by the price of labour, the wage of labour. So we're looking at product per dollar spent. And look, we're looking at the same for capital, marginal product of capital, the additional output, divided by the price of capital. Okay, so what we're simply saying, essentially, is if the rate of return on labour is greater than the rate of return on capital, then we should use more labour. Again, interpret these phrases. Marginal product divided by the price of labour essentially is giving us a dollar return on labour. Marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital is giving us a dollar return on the capital that we're employing per dollar spent. So, in other words, if the marginal product divided by price of labour is greater than the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital, then keep on employing more labour. But we know labour will suffer from diminishing returns. In other words, the marginal product will decline until eventually the marginal product of labour divided by the price of labour is equal to the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. And then, essentially, we know we're at the efficient levels.